by Acting City Manager Lopez.
Good evening, Acting City Manager Chris Lopez. Tonight's presentation is primarily geared to the members that aren't primarily familiar with the city's budget or what the budget process is all about. And so it's really aligned to those that, again, as I mentioned, that are unfamiliar with it, those that are viewing on YouTube. And so I really wanted to create, as well as the executive team, a foundation from which we could all work from. And so as we continue to move forward on the city's budget, a lot of the terms that we talk about in the future are the ones that we will be defining and explaining here tonight. So with that being said, last Thursday evening I had the pleasure of participating on a panel related to economic development in the Valley, and we had the mayor was there, Councilmember Krupa, as well as Councilmember Principal were in attendance there as well. And I really wanted to take an opportunity to highlight some of the development that's going on in our community, because I think you'll see in a few slides from now why that's so important. This single-family residential development is at State Street in Fruitvale, 193 single-family residential homes in our community. This project adjacent to one another off of Florida at the Winco Shopping Center, at Chase Bank, as well as a Starbucks. Starbucks obviously is the sales tax generator here in our community. Additionally, at our Auto Mall, we're actually really fortunate to have quite a number of sales and transactions that happen at that location. Some improvements over at the Hemet Auto Mall include the Hyundai Ford Dodge dealership remodel, as well as the new Chrysler Dodge Jeep dealership here in our city. We've got quite a number of projects in the planning phases. A couple of them are highlighted here. And obviously I want to thank Community Development for putting this presentation together. I recycled a lot of these images in these slides, so it saved me quite a bit of time in putting this together. And so again, now let's start with the Budget 101 discussion that I referenced earlier today. So what is the budget? The budget is an estimate of income, revenues, and expenditures for a given set of time. So for us here at the City of Hemet, that's from July 1 of the current year to June 30th of the following year. And so what is the budget all about? Well, it's a financial plan for the City of Hemet. It reflects the priorities of the city, so when the council adopts the budget, they will be making policy decisions based on the priorities and how those funds will be allocated to fund operations within the city. It sets the funding levels for city services. It may change throughout the year, mid-year, new appropriations, transfers. It's not uncommon for the city staff to come back, request changes to the budget as revenues increase, or as additional emergency items come up, additional appropriations to expend those funds. And finally, as we get into some of the funds that are made up in the budget, it is governed by local, state, and federal law as it relates to restrictions that are placed on the expenditure of some of these funds. So a few fund types that are important to our conversation, and you'll see as we continue to move forward. The general fund, it's used to account for most of the governmental functions which have no restrictions for use. Special revenue funds, legally restricted for particular purposes. Proprietary funds, such as internal service funds, they're used to account for goods or services by one department to others. And finally, enterprise funds, internal operations funded by ratepayers. And as I mentioned, there are restrictions on how we can or cannot use these funds. So as it relates to fund types, I've included a number of funds that we have here in the City of Hemet. Our discussion today will focus primarily on the general fund, but general governmental funds also include Measure U. Special revenue funds include RMRA SB1 funds, AB 2766 subvention funds, CDBG, those are federal dollars that are allocated to agencies. Measure A and development impact fee funds. As I stated, those are, we're bound by legal obligations to how we can or cannot spend those funds. Internal service funds, a few examples of those include workers' compensation, equipment maintenance and replacement, information technology, and finally facilities maintenance. And within our city, an enterprise fund that we have is the water fund. So definition of the general fund: the primary fund of the city used to account for all revenues and expenditures of the city not legally restricted as to use. This fund is used to accumulate the cost of the city's general operations and services such as parks, fire, and police protection. The general fund is the broadest fund that we have in terms of what we can fund with this operation. So a note on other funds: while we won't be talking about them here, we will be focusing on the general fund. There are healthy balances in special revenue funds and enterprise funds. Those funds cannot be used to fund general fund day-to-day obligations, but are necessary and vital to maintaining and improving our community, and we will discuss those at a later time. So now we're going to start drilling down into the City of Hemet's general fund and the revenue sources associated with the City of Hemet's general fund. This table here illustrates the largest sources of revenue for the general fund. As you can see, the highest generator for the revenue of the general fund is sales and use tax. I've also included a past few years of actual revenues that we've accrued here at the city so that you can get a perspective of what the trends are with respect to those funds. State motor vehicle in lieu tax is the second highest funding source for the general fund in the City of Hemet. Property taxes come in at third, and you can see that there's a pretty impressive jump from 2014-15 actuals to the 17-18 actuals that we have here at the City of Hemet. And in fourth place, the IWN franchise fee. That fund that revenue source is primarily generated with the agreement with CR&R, so it's not subject to change. It's subject to the terms of that agreement. If you take those top four revenue sources, you can see that they comprise a significant amount of the general fund. So in 2014-2015, those four funds comprised approximately 65% of the general fund revenues for the City of Hemet. As you can see, in fiscal year 17-18, it's actually increased to about 72% of the general fund revenues. One thing that I do want to mention is that Measure U revenues have been excluded from this discussion, so this is not part of our conversation today. So some key takeaways that I think we should talk about when it comes to these revenue sources. The major revenue sources continue to be a larger percentage of our general fund. So as you can see in fiscal year 14-15, the percentage of those four revenue streams were 65% of our general fund. In fiscal year 17-18, it's 72%. So other sources of revenues are becoming a smaller portion of the general fund. We have seen an increase of approximately 1.9 in these revenue sources since 2015. And my apologies, that wasn't updated to reflect the fiscal year 17-18. That column was just added this morning. So what I mean by that is the other sources of revenue for the general fund include fees for service. And so one of the things we'll get into conversations a little bit later is, have we done our job in terms of updating those fees to accurately reflect the true cost of providing those services? So we haven't seen, although we have seen the top four increase in the amount that they actually generate, we're not seeing that same increase on the other side of the revenues for the general fund. So I've included a few other revenue sources for the general fund, just so that you got an idea of what else makes up the general fund. Transit occupancy tax, you can see, has risen over the course of the last few years. Business license renewals have seen a slight increase from 2014-2015. I wanted to talk about the mutual aid reimbursements. So when the city gets called to help out on mutual aid, the city does get reimbursed from whatever agency is requesting that help. This is important to note because Chief Brown has made a extreme commitment to make sure that when our troops are deployed to those instances, that we're doing our follow-up and due diligence to make sure that we collect that revenue so that it isn't an impact on the general fund. And so that, as that's rising, I would imagine that, I'm not going to say that it's going to increase, but there is an effort on the chief's part to make sure that we are collecting those revenues to offset those costs in the fire department. The last three ones that I've included here are really important because they really they offset the fee for providing the services to the communities. So fire inspection services, as a member of the community or developer needs those services, that essentially is covered by the fee that gets generated to the city. And so those items, essentially, in theory, what we're looking at is cost recovery. And so in the absence of updating our fees for service, those become problematic because then they become a burden on the general fund, which creates problems for us. So these are our operations within the city of Hemet that are funded through the general fund. I'm not going to say that they're 100% funded through the general fund, but there are some ways in which there are offsets. But these departments here do get a portion of general funds. I wanted to point out community development. Now, community development is actually a small net cost to the city of Hemet. And what I mean by that is, in the process of collecting fees for the projects that they're working on, they essentially covered the cost of providing the service. And so when we talk about departments being, we'll call it expenditure neutral or no net cost to the city of Hemet, the community development department is probably the most probably productive department in terms of making sure that there is no net cost to the general fund, which is very important to the city of Hemet. So with that being said, I wanted to provide another term for everyone, and don't worry, there won't be a test at the end. Structural deficit is a budget deficit that results from a fundamental imbalance in government receipts and expenditures as opposed to one based on one-off or short-term factors. A government budget deficit occurs when a government spends more than it receives in tax revenue, while a structural deficit is when a budget deficit persists for some time. So the image that I've included here is straight from last year's budget book. So I'll just read it so everyone can hear it. I don't think that everyone can read that. But this is as it relates to the fiscal year 18-19 budget that we're currently in. The initial shortfall in the recommended budget of $3.5 million is eliminated by the following: using $1.5 million in fund balances from 3 internal service funds that have accumulated a balance over the years, instituting a hiring moratorium which would not impact Measure U funded positions, a savings estimate of approximately $1 million, which represents approximately 4% of the general fund payroll. Reduce training budgets for all general fund departments by half, a savings of approximately $87,000. Equipment replacement will not be funded for fiscal year 18-19, a savings of approximately $517,000. And the deferral of several facilities maintenance projects, a savings of approximately $505,000. And so when we talk about the balanced budget that we're currently in now, that's how we were able to balance it. It was by not funding certain priorities or certain items in our budget, but then also doing some things operationally to help close the gap between the revenues that we were anticipated to have and the expenditures that we plan to have as well. So this next slide that I've prepared for everyone is a historical context of actual expenditures over the course of the last few years since 2010. And so every time you see a gray bar, those are the general fund expenditures. The teal bars are the actual revenues. And so when you see gray bars exceed the teal bars, that means that the expenditures are over and above revenues received. And so that's when the city has needed to utilize other sources of funding to make up that difference. What I have noted for everyone is that in 2012, you see a spike in revenues, and that's really attributed to the refuse franchise from that year. In terms of years where revenues exceeded expenditures, 2013 comes out as a year where we had more revenues than we had expenditures, and it looks like 2014 is pretty near to what the revenues and expenditures were for that time period. The rest of the years, as you can see, expenditures have exceeded revenues here at the City of Hemet. And again, just a point of clarification, Measure U has been excluded from these graphs. So now we're going to dig down into some of our expenses across the general fund. And so where are these expenses coming from? Public safety is a large portion of our funds, but I would be remiss in not mentioning that that operation is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So it's not like they get a break for holidays. They're still required to be on the job. So obviously you would expect those expenditures to be higher than the rest of the operational departments. You can see the gray bars are public safety, and what I mean by that is police and fire. The teal bars are non-safety, so that's the non-safety, that's community development, that's public works, engineering, the city clerk's office, city manager's office, all those other departments that I talked about earlier, that's where they're located. And so you can see that there has been some growth in the non-safety departments, but you can see also too that there has been some growth in the public safety departments as well. It appears as if that is a little bit steeper than the growth in non-safety departments. Again, Measure U has been excluded. I did want to mention something. In conversations with our public safety chiefs, there hasn't been a large amount of personnel that's been added, and quite honestly, I think there's probably been just a handful, if that, added to these costs. And so what's really driving some of these costs are things that are largely out of our control. PERS, other post-employment benefits that we have to fund and have to pay that we don't have any control over. And so the council did, as a result of PEPRA and the new PERS rules coming through, with new employees, those obligations aren't the same as what we have for some of the classic members, but it will take quite a bit of time before those actualizations and realizations of savings or lessening the burden on the general fund actually occurs. But there have been quite a number of things that the council has done over the past few years to help try and control those costs. I know that the council brings this topic up quite frequently in conversations that I have with them. So I really wanted to point out internal service costs for the city of Hemet. Workers' compensation and liability, with public safety being the largest departments in our operation, and the risk that's associated with doing those operations, obviously they are going to be involved in situations that increase those costs. And so it's, I wouldn't say that it's a fault of them, it's just a matter of the nature of the job. So it's not anything that they can largely control, but it is something that continues to drive up costs for us. Vehicle maintenance, again, that is something as it relates to the users, departments that utilize fleet maintenance. That is a cost that gets absorbed by the department. And so in theory, the city manager's office doesn't have, I think we've got one car in our fleet that hardly gets used. And so I would expect that our fleet costs are lower than, let's say, police or fire, because they have a lot more rolling units out in the streets. Equipment replacement in years past, in 2015 is the first, it's the gray bar. You can see that there wasn't very much allocated to equipment replacement. You have seen an increase over the last few years. I think that's largely a result of extending cars beyond their useful life and trying to make the best of that, and finally getting to the point where cars needed to be replaced. And so our fleet staff has done an incredible job in making sure that those cars are used and continue to be used throughout their useful life. The one that is most striking is the last column on the far right, the post-employment benefits. And that is something that, again, is out of our control. We will be doing some things in the near term to see if we can explore some potential areas to try and control some of those costs. But as you can see, we're upwards of close to $3 million in post-employment benefits for primarily, obviously, retired employees from the city of Hemet. And then, as I mentioned earlier, internal services are spread amongst funds, including water, sewer, and general fund. So these costs here aren't specifically just borne by the general fund. They are spread amongst the various funds that we do have in our operation. So again, I wanted to go back to this slide, to this historical context, because I think a natural question is, well, if revenues have exceeded expenditures, or I'm sorry, if expenditures have exceeded revenues, how have we been able to maintain our expenditures? And so that's the next slide that I'll show you. So then this next graph shows the uncommitted general fund balance above the 20% reserve. So the City Council has adopted a reserve policy saying that it will reserve 20% of its general fund expenditures as a reserve. And so what's happened is, since 2015, the uncommitted general fund balance has been used to shore up the shortfall in the general fund. And so you can see in 2015, approximately over $8 million was in uncommitted general fund balance above the 20%. And you can see in 2016, we've had to take from that to cover the expenditures. And in 2017, we've had to do that again. And so these are all publicly available. I got this from our CAFR, our Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, and these are all available publicly online. And you can see this. I pulled it right from there. So again, couple key takeaways. Expenditures have outpaced revenues. So the city has utilized uncommitted general fund balance above the 20% reserve to maintain its expenditures. One-time revenues have been utilized to balance the budget. The uncommitted fund balance is now at a critical point and cannot sustain additional expenditures without entering the 20% reserve threshold. So we are completing the CAFR for fiscal year 17-18. So I didn't have a chance to update this document, but obviously the message is clear that unless something changes with respect to reserve balance policy or some of the other policies I'll get into a little bit later, we are going to be unable to do both of those things, maintain the reserve and accomplish all of our expenditures as well, keeping the status quo. So where are we now? This is where I'll provide the update of where we are with the budget process. So we've had 3 meetings with the budget committee. The most recent one was on Monday afternoon. And I thought that we covered some of these same topics in that discussion as well. We've had a preliminary review of revenues. Departments have estimated based on the actual amounts that they've collected. That information has been provided to finance, so we are in the process of buttoning down those numbers and making sure that those are as accurate as can be. Personnel costs have been updated, so there are natural increases that happen as a result of things that happen throughout the year, and so those have been updated for us as well. Contractual obligations have been updated for the city of Hemet. And what I mean by that is the Simpson Center, the Ramona Shelter, communication systems, there are contracts that we have that just naturally have inflators built into them, and so we've updated those costs as well. I really want to give a kudos to the executive team because all this work had been done in 4 weeks, and I've never seen that done. And so I just want to give a kudos to the team for getting that taken care of. I know it's been a frantic just time to get that information taken care of, and I appreciate the efforts because without them, I mean, we wouldn't be at the place that we are now. So thank you. The other thing that I wanted to mention was we were given direction about 4 weeks ago about delving into the rollover budget. And so I wanted to provide some information related to what that rollover budget means. So that means that there are no new personnel that are added, so no additions to maintenance and operations as well. There are contractual costs that are increased. MOUs, salary increases, retiree health increases, PERS, etc., do not stay flat. And so one of the challenges that we have is, although that we're not going to be adding up until this point anything to that budget, it doesn't stay the same. So there are increases that we have to account for. That has largely been taken care of and addressed by finance. And so now we're at a good starting point in terms of next steps for the budget. So next steps for the budget. This morning, we had a chance to talk to the executive team and talk about next steps for the budget. We will be coordinating, and we already have set up dates to meet with all of our departments to talk about all expenditures within their operation. There are probably going to be times where we need to address whether that's adding a position to take care of things that just need to happen as a result of mandates that we have. We need to really talk to our departments and figure out what those areas are and figure out what it is that we're planning on doing this upcoming year. Again, as I mentioned, those departmental meetings are ongoing, and I've already had a chance to meet one-on-one with a number of our directors to talk about that and how we can move forward. We need to be real about our capacity, and so one of the things that the E-team is doing collectively is that we are generating a list of projects that we have internally, and we are going to align that with the budget. And so we're going to have some conversations about realistically what can we do given the limited staffing. One of the slides that I showed was that staffing has stayed relatively flat over the course of the last few years, yet we've added a lot of new projects to the staff. So in the absence of adding additional staff, we have our staff that is trying to do everything at once, which creates some capacity issues. And then finally, I think there's a commitment from everybody on the management team that we need to discuss and figure out a solution to our budget deficit. So the structural deficit did not occur overnight, but we must remain committed to solving this issue. So further discussions to happen as a result of solving and addressing that budget deficit. So I'm not asking for direction at this point, but I wanted to make sure that these policy questions were on the radar for the council. And so I'll just go through them one by one. Does the council wish to adjust its reserve policy? As I mentioned, it's currently stated at 20%. Does the council wish to look into that? Does the council wish to revisit the allocations for Measure U for public safety and the general fund? As I mentioned, the driving forces on public safety as a result of those increased costs are largely not because we've added a lot of personnel or because we're adding a lot of contracts. It's largely as a result of the costs that are out of our control. Does the council wish to update its fees to reflect its true costs of providing services? I believe the last user fee study that was conducted was a handful of years ago. And so as I mentioned, as those top 4 revenue sources continue to get bigger, those other sources of revenue, including those fees for service, are not growing with the growth that we've seen on the other side. So does the council wish to update its fees to reflect its true cost of providing services? Does the council wish to adopt a policy of cost recovery for special events throughout the community? I know that this one is a very delicate conversation to have, but given the circumstances that we're currently in, does the council wish to continue operating in that manner? The staff would like to explore some of those opportunities and what that means in terms of capacity and staffing moving forward. And then finally, does the council wish to explore any other opportunities to align expenditures with revenues? So with that being said, I'd be happy to field any questions or expand upon further discussions as it relates to the budget. And we do have our executive team here, most of the executive team here, to answer any questions as well.
First of all, kudos to you and your team and the executive team, because to put this together in such a short period of time is monumental. I have a question with regards to, I don't have a page number, but it's in respect to the other sources of revenue, on the cost recovery side,
Sure.
do we know why those have, especially fire inspection services and engineer map plan check, those are so much lower than they had been in 14?
I don't know why. If anybody has an idea as to why, nothing comes to
maybe
me.
that's just it's a question I have right now, and perhaps we're not at the point where we have an answer for that, but it's something I'd like to know.
Yeah, and I think part of those discussions with the departments will be, the revenue collection. I know that in engineering right now, we're spending a lot of time in creating our systems to make sure that we're doing the best that we can for cost recovery. So it could be a part of the market as it relates to the economy that's driving that, or it could just be, potentially buttoning down, tightening up our systems to collect the appropriate revenue that we need to. But that's all part of the discussions that we have with our departments.
And another thing is on the actual expenditures, the historical context, and the increase in expenditures. I know in our discussion earlier, you had mentioned that the majority of that is based on things out of our control, like PERS and
Other post-employment benefits. That's actually a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up. In that time, with the historical context, there have been a number of things that have even made things more difficult for the city of Hemet, and that includes the dissolution of RDA,
Right.
specifically because those responsibilities and those tasks still needed to remain with the city of Hemet, but the funding source of those was gone. And so that meant that the general fund needed to take on those responsibilities and those obligations without a funding source that it once had. So you're absolutely right. The challenge.
And that was over an $11 million hit.
That's correct. Yeah.
And it's pretty hard to compensate for that in a short period of time. And hopefully some of that revenue will be coming back. We can only hope. So does any other council members have any comments, questions, or just basically something to reflect on as we move forward?
Sure. And I did want to point out that, the public safety departments do a job that is absolutely just crucial for our community. And so, my intent was not to say that they're at fault or any of that. I'm appreciative of the work that they do. I know a lot of us couldn't do that job. And I know the council has made that an absolute utmost priority for the city of Hemet. And so we've been challenged, but I think there's a commitment from everyone to explore in terms of how we can solve this issue. But I wanted to make sure that our public safety crews knew that the intent was not to do any of that, but show them that, I have the utmost respect for them. Sure.
I do have a question, similar to the mayor's question on the other sources of revenue, where you have these figures in each of the columns. Is that gross revenue coming in from those sources?
That's correct.
The reason I ask that is, like, for example, fire inspection services or building plan check. Is that a gross revenue, or is it a net revenue after the cost of providing services?
That's just the revenue that we've received for that operation. And these are all, I took these, the actuals from the budget documents to show the actuals. And so there's probably, over 200 revenue sources that we have. And so I just took out a few of them, but they're all listed in the budget document.
I'm just thinking that one possible explanation, and I'm not looking for an answer tonight, but the lack of staffing in each of those categories, and some of them that we've had to contract out for services, might have had an impact on that decline in the revenue.
It's possible, but I know that we use quite a number of plan check consultants and contractors, and so essentially when we receive that revenue that's generated gets used to pay for the work that gets done by the contractor. So essentially, we would like to gear it to the point where it is essentially a no cost to the city of Hemet.
Of course, theoretically, fees for services are theoretically supposed to be a wash.
That's correct, but when you have an updated fees for service, that's when
Right.
you, yeah, but you're right, correct.
And again, thank you for the very thorough walkthrough and the historical perspective. Very valuable.
Sure.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you very
Thank you.
much. And thanks again to the E-Team for all their efforts. Okay, and I was remiss in introducing Stephanie Gutierrez from City Attorney's Office. She's filling in for him tonight while he's doing his duty as a dad in D.C. with his student. So we appreciate you being here.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Okay, with that, we'll go into closed session. Are there any members of the public that would like to comment on any of the closed session items? Okay, with that, we'll recess to closed session.